These guys just look right in the camera and lie. And that's what it's just so brazen, it's hard to believe.
In this episode, we're going to have a conversation with Warren Throckmorton, who's been spending several years pushing back against lies by Christian nationalists like David Barton. Barton is an influential figure today. Speaker Mike Johnson is one of his proteges, and he has helped push lies about the Christian founding of the United States, about how we really weren't founded for separation of church and state when we actually were, and a whole lot of other things. And as he's pushing a public policy agenda for Christian nationalism, he's done so by making up a new story about America's founding. So we'll be talking about Warren about a number of his works, including Getting Jefferson Right, fact-checking claims about Thomas Jefferson, now out this year in a special third edition. Warren's also got a forthcoming book that he'll mention in our conversation that's coming out next year, The Christian Past That Wasn't, debunking the Christian nationalist myths that hijack history, as well as his podcast, Telling Jefferson Lies. So I was really excited to have Warren on the program to talk about all of this and more, because it's really important that we understand the false claims that are being made about America and how we can push back against them today. How we can show that separation of church and state is good for both. That we were not founded as a Christian nation. We were founded with something even better. A unique experiment that we need to hold on to today. Now, before we jump into that conversation, I want to let you know that I have a new book coming out in October, but it's available for pre-order now wherever you buy your books. The Bible According to Christian Nationalists, Exploiting Scripture for Political Power. Comes out officially October 7th. Got links in the description where you can buy it, or again, just check it out wherever you buy books. And what I do in this book is to push back against the misuse of the Bible by Christian nationalists. I give examples of how they misuse it, and then ways that we can push back against it to defend our faith against this bad and heretical theology that's really more about political power than anything else. In many ways, I'm doing in the Bible According to Christian Nationalists a very similar thing that Warren's been doing in all of his work. While he's focused on the bad history and the false history, I'm looking at the bad theology and the false claims about the Bible. But all of this is ways that Christian nationalists are trying to seize power by misleading us about either history or the Bible. So I think you'll find both of these projects to be really important in this moment that we find ourselves in. So please go and pre-order The Bible According to Christian Nationalists. And now here's my conversation with Warren Throckmorton on Getting Jefferson Right. Warren, first of all, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, it's great to talk with you. We've met in person, and I've been on your podcast. We'll talk about that in a moment, but I'm excited to have you on Dangerous Dogma, and we're going to be talking about our mutual good friend, David Barton. And I say that in complete jest. I want to get us starting talking about the special third edition of Getting Jefferson Right, which shows that there's a lot we need to fix here about getting Jefferson right, because it's a pretty thick book, and it's a third edition, meaning things just keep getting done wrong. So let's talk about the origin story of this project. For those that aren't familiar, who is David Barton, and how did you get into this business of fact checking and working on his false history?
Right. Well, I started on that in 2011. That's the first blog post I did on David Barton, fact checking him. The origin of that, what got me started in that, was I had, well, no, this goes back a little farther. In 2009, I had taken an interest in a bill in Uganda that criminalized or further criminalized homosexuality. In my former life, I was very involved in the gay struggle about whether gays could change. I started out promoting the right of people to try to change. Then I came to the conclusion or the belief that was not something that was healthy for people to try to do, and that was a shock to many in the community that I was working in at the time, and it led me to really look at efforts to demonize LGBTQ people as harmful, not just beyond the therapist's role that I was trained in, but more in the political role. And I came to understand, and actually many of the people who were involved in the movement agreed later that the whole ex-gay idea was basically a political kind of maneuver to uh, just to fight against gay rights, gay civil rights. And no matter what you think about homosexuality in a moral sense, there's no reason to deprive anybody of civil rights. And so this whole thing just sort of evolved in my mind that, my whatever moral position I had or anybody has, they can't use that to deprive people of civil rights. And I looked around, um, for people who were really promoting this idea that church and state were not separate, and that you should, that the government should take an interest in depriving people of their civil rights because of their private choices. Well, anyway, back to this thing in Uganda, that the government was basing their idea that you should basically put people to death for homosexuality on the fact that they were a Christian nation. America is not the only place around the world where politicians use religion to promote their political ideas. And that's what the politicians in Uganda were doing. They were saying they were a Christian nation, so we need to follow the Bible, and the Bible says do this. And boy, that really, it bothered me, for one thing, that I ever had anything to do with saying homosexuality should be regulated in any way. And so I came up very publicly and said I disagree with that. Of course, still do. And I looked around, who's responsible for this idea that church and state are not separate? I thought everybody should know that. Well, anyway, now we get to the end of the long story. David Barton in the United States. And you'd think I would have known this guy and known, what he was doing, but I really didn't. And so I started to learn more about him, and I started to read some of his stories that he was using to justify the idea that the founders wanted policymakers to take religion into account, the Christian, conservative Christian religion into account. And I thought, yeah, I'm a psychology professor, counselor by training, but that doesn't sound right to me. And so I went over to the history department of my college, Grove City College at the time, and I said, "Who is this guy, and what is he saying?" And they said, "Oh, he's he's not reliable." I said, "Was anybody writing about it?" And there were a few people, but mostly they were not in the church. Mostly they were not evangelical types writing about it. And so they could be pretty easily dismissed. And so I thought, well, I like to go off on rabbit trails. So I started debunking these things, and I found that it was fascinating, absolutely fascinating, to get into the primary sources and find that time after time after time, the stories he was telling to to prop up this Christian nationalist dogma, this ideology, they were not true stories. And so that was 2011 when I started doing that. And then I heard he was coming out with a book on Jefferson through Thomas Nelson. And I thought, surely he is not going to keep telling those stories in this book published by a reputable publisher. Surely he is going to clean up his act. Well, I thought, well, I'll get the book and see. And so I got an advance copy of the book. I don't know why they sent it to me, but they did. And he didn't. I mean, they were all the same stories. So I thought, well, I'm going to put together, my blog posts and maybe debunk a few more of these things and make up a paper and send it to some folks, see if it does any good. And I just got hooked into the whole process, and I thought this could be a book. And so I recruited a friend of mine, Michael Coulter. I was into it a month or so, and I said, "Man, we could make this into a book. Let's do this." And he said, "Sure, let's do it." And so we made an ebook. Kindle books were just coming along about that time, and so we a month after his book came out, our book came out, we were we were ready. I mean, we were writing feverishly because his book was already going through the whole process that you do when you write a book. As you know, it's months and years before it comes out. Well, we were writing the whole time that he was going through the galley proofs and all that. So his comes out and ours comes out 2 or 3 weeks later, and it's an ebook to start with. And so we published it through Amazon because no publisher is going to go that fast. And so it was self-published, and a paperback came out a couple of months later, and it was surprising to us how much attention it got. There was a summer of a lot. There was a lot of attention that was both within his circles and outside his circles. And eventually, Thomas Nelson got a hold of our book, and you know, and anyway, eventually Thomas Nelson pulled his book off of the shelves.
Yeah, which I still remember is stunning, and yet at the same time, like he hasn't gone away, and
No,
I mean, in many ways, he's gained more influence and power within within the Republican Party, within the Trump administration, than he had even then, and he's still telling the same false stories about America's founding, still using made up quotations sometimes, although he has stopped using some of them that he's been called out on. I mean, it is stunning, which is why we're getting a third edition because he's still going, so you're still going.
mm-hmm.
So maybe talk a little bit about the time since the first edition came out. Now you've got the third edition. What has that process been like in doing updates? What is some of your focus now that perhaps wasn't there when you first started challenging all of his false claims?
Well, as you said, it is thicker. The first book was about 2/3 of this. Maybe we added, I don't know, maybe 100+ pages to it. But we went through and we wanted to look at what were some of the claims that he continued to make. And a lot of the ones about the Jefferson Bible he continues to use, and the ones that make it seem like Jefferson really didn't believe in the separation of church and state, he continues to use. And so those are still in there. But we added some more about Jefferson the enslaver because he continues to talk about, and it's a matter of great interest to those who bring him on their shows, their radio shows and the like, to try to excuse Jefferson from the accusations of racism and various related claims. So we expanded that chapter greatly. Jefferson expand. We didn't have, for instance, in the first edition, or very much in the second edition, we didn't have some about Jefferson expanding slavery into the Louisiana Territory. We have that in the third edition. Jefferson advised friends to invest in slavery, that you make more money, more profit by having women have slaves than the work of a worker in the field. In other words, it's better just to let them reproduce. And Barton gives him credit for ending the slave trade, and of course, historically that's true. He signed the bill that ended the slave trade when the Constitution said it could happen. But all that did, maybe not all that did, but one of the things it did was to make the domestic slaves more valuable. And he didn't, female slaves didn't stop having children. And so that's where the growth in slavery came, was that way. And he didn't free his slaves. Barton said that Jefferson couldn't free his slaves because of Virginia law. And of course, that's just simply not true. When the law on manumission in 1782 was passed, and other people started freeing their slaves, and he didn't do it. So we expanded uh, in many of the areas that people are interested in, and first, there's just been this great expansion of interest in exonerating the founding fathers on their on their racism, and that's part of our expansion in this book.
Oh, you're starting to sound kind of woke. This is get sound like some DEI, revisionist history here that you're doing, making America sound bad.
Well, I would have to plead guilty to I was yes, woke would be a pretty decent description of me. I think I probably don't look very woke, but I would claim that.
So, I mean, this is, I think, a really critical time, and it's important that you're continuing to push back here because, next year is the 250th anniversary of
Hmm.
America. We're going to see an even stronger revival of the Barton-esque claims about America's founding, about how we were allegedly started as a Christian nation. He's got the ear of a number of people in the Trump administration, and of course, President Trump's making a big deal about the 250th anniversary. I mean, this seems like a really significant time for those of us who believe in the separation of church and state and who want to get the history right to be paying attention to what's being said and then also why it's wrong.
Yeah, that's right. Uh, that was also in our thinking as we came out with this. When we did, uh, we didn't want to wait too long or come too early, but anyway, we wanted to get that information out there, and that's also behind the new book, "The Christian Past That Wasn't," that's coming out in May of 2026. That's very deliberate, because, as you said, already this year, uh, the president has signed several executive orders that directly bear on revisionist history, and we we need historians more than ever to step up and respond to this revisionist history. Uh, so I feel like it's going to be a very important 2 years, and there'll be residuals, of course, after that, where people's views of the founding will be shaped and reshaped, uh, and very deliberately, by the patriotic education movement that Trump is trying to revive, and that David Barton has been promoting for his whole career, really.
Yeah, in Baptizing America, when Bo and I were working on that, we found that with the bicentennial in 1976, there was a spike of Christian nationalism in services, in church services around the 4th of July, but it really was like a high watermark for the 70s. But then, of course, like you said, then there's the residual, right? Once these stories were revived, you see them spreading, for the next few years. And that's what I'm worried about is going to happen next year, which is why we need works like Getting Jefferson Right, your new book that's coming out in May. I wonder if you could talk about what do you think that pastors and church leaders can do now, over the course of this next year, besides, of course, buy your book and read it. What can we be doing to help prepare people so that they're not taken advantage of and they're not misled by, the David Bartons and others who are pushing some false claims about America's founding?
I do think that it is important to start the study of the founding, although not necessarily in church. I don't want to, in a sense, go the other direction and say the church is responsible for our civic education, but I do think that it's fair for pastors to, and for church leaders, such as yourself and others, such as what you're doing now, to advocate for studies of books, advocate for civic education, to network with public school teachers, um, to network with other community leaders, to be part of those committees. A lot of what will happen is community based. Of course, there'll be a lot of efforts to lead from the top, but there are going to be uh, local historical societies. There will be humanities commissions and so forth. There's so many of those all over the country. And to the degree that people who believe in separation of church and state can be a part of those, I think that's going to be very valuable, because we'll be able to stick up for good history as those local celebrations are also being planned.
So we kind of briefly mentioned, but you also have a podcast, Telling Jefferson Lies, and
Mhm.
people can find that pretty much anywhere they listen to podcasts. Tell us a little bit about that project and what you're trying to do there.
Well, the podcast started last year. The first season was that story about David Barton's book being pulled. There there were some things that had never been told about the inside part of that story. I was able to interview some people close to the decision. They didn't. They still didn't want to be identified by name, but I was able to get some information that I didn't have before. I also interviewed some of the historians. One of the, let me just tell you this much. Uh, there was a fellow named Jay Richards. Jay Richards is an interesting guy. He's a philosopher. I think of him as actually more of an individual who probably aligns with the far right, but at the time he was very skeptical of some of the history that he had been hearing from David Barton, just the facts of it. And he got a hold of our book and he said, "Man, this really confirms what I was worried about. We shouldn't be afraid of the facts, even if we're far right." Was his view. And so he recruited, uh, I never got an exact number, but somewhere between 8 and 10 Christian historians to read our book and to read David Barton's book on Jefferson. And he wanted them just to like render a verdict. You know, who's got the facts here? And they all came back and said, we did. And so he confronted David Barton along with Glenn Beck and there was a couple other kind of big name pastors. I'm blanking on their name right now. But in the podcast, we tell that story. And we go through from the very beginning of David Barton's career, talk about his rise to prominence. And, actually, the Jefferson Lies, that was not the first book that had been pulled because of historical errors. He pulled his own book.
It's pretty rough when you're the publisher and you disagree with the book you published that you wrote and published. I mean, that's rough.
Yeah, well, he would never admit, that it was because of errors. But in the book, he said that Thomas Jefferson spoke to the Danbury Baptist, instead of writing them a letter. He said he spoke to them, and and told them a bunch of stuff he didn't say. But it was just a butchering of the whole thing. So anyway, he eventually took that book off the market. You can't buy that unless you buy a used copy of it. So that all of that background is in the first couple of episodes of Telling Jefferson Lies. Then the story of the book being pulled is the next 3 or 4 episodes. So I transitioned from there to talk about bad history in general. What it's about, what it means, what are some examples of that. And then toward the end of the podcast, I talk about why is separation of church and state good for church and state. We got a really good system. We just need to hold on to it. And and that set up the second season, which the first part of the season, I debunked Charlie Kirk's viral video of why he said we're a Christian nation. And then the last, of course, I interviewed you about the Jefferson so-called prayer. Then Mike Johnson, who is a David Barton, guru or person who likes David Barton. And then the last few episodes have been interviews with different people who have perspectives on Christian nationalism. So it's about over with for this season. I'm going to do one more episode or a couple more episodes, and the last one will be to promote the new book. I think is what it really amounts to.
Yeah, well, it's a lot of good material for people. They can choose to listen to some stuff. They can pick up your books and read them. There's a lot of different ways to engage with all of this work you're doing to try to help challenge this bad history. As we get close to wrapping up our time, I wonder, and this might be hard. I wonder, is there like a favorite, and I mean this in like the absurdist way, like a favorite claim, like the most outlandish You can't believe that Barton has ever done. And this may be like asking, you shouldn't ever ask people to pick their favorite kid or their favorite pet or whatever. But I'm asking you, like, what's your favorite David Barton lie that you've had to debunk?
Oh my goodness. Well, let's see. I think the one that's I'd like to end it on a humorous note, but I can't. It's hard to because there's the one about it is absurd. Here, the one where he says that Jefferson couldn't free his slaves, and what makes that absurd is not just that it would have sure it would have been hard for Jefferson because he drank so much wine and he made so many improvements to Monticello. He was always spending money. Uh, it's incredible, really, how much wine he bought. I mean, in the $50,000 a year range. I mean, it was crazy how much wine. I'm sure he served a lot of people too. It wasn't just him, as a wino, but and he spent a lot of money, so it would have been hard, but he could have done it. And I think we can judge him by his own words, right? Because those were his words when he said all men are created equal, all the natural rights of men. Uh, anyway, but he just left out the part of the law in his book that said you could free your slaves while you were alive. And he said in his book, old George Washington could do it because you could do it when you died. That's why George Washington did it. There was a loophole in the law. Now, the only loophole was the fact that you didn't include in your book the part that said you could free your slaves when you were alive. How do you explain the fact that Jefferson did free a couple of his slaves when he was alive and that Robert Carter III freed almost 500 slaves in 1491, I think it was, or 1791? I mean, it's amazing that you would be that brazen. And I think that's what always gets me about this is the guy, and not just him. There's Christian nationalists who will look right in the camera and say, and Ben Franklin said, let's pray, guys, at the Constitutional Convention. And they all knelt in prayer for hours, hours and hours and hours, when in fact they didn't do any of that. So these guys just look right in the camera and lie. And that's what it's just so brazen. It's hard to believe.
Yeah, it's not sloppiness, right? It's that brazenness, and I think it's good that you use the L word, that it's a lie. Like it is deceptively editing the documents and just flat out saying things that they have to know is not true. And all in the name of making us a Christian nation, right? I mean, like, wow, doesn't seem very Christian. I
Yeah.
mean, David Barton is literally, going around the country trying to get states right now, state legislators, to pass laws to mandate the posting of a highly edited version of the Ten Commandments, but the Ten Commandments on public school classrooms. And here's someone that's going around and bearing false witness all the time about our nation's founding. I mean, it's really stunning to see this kind of deception, especially when it's done in the name of God.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess it should be renamed the Nine Commandments, maybe, or something. I don't know what the deal is. I don't
Yeah.
understand it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it just goes to show this whole project is about that power that more than anything. It's not about making us a Christian nation.
Well, yeah. And in the new book, I talk about one of the things that I think I'm excited about this new book is that I have a chapter on the psychological kind of what the psychological factors are behind Christian nationalism. I talk about fear and I talk about social group identification, but I also talk about power and that power is a big part of what the attraction is to the ideology. And, power is, it's kind of obscene, but it really serves a psychological purpose. And, at heart, a lot of people are just afraid. They're afraid of change. They're afraid of a lot of things, but it drives them to not a very Christian solution. I mean, the solution isn't to grab the sword and cut somebody's ear off. That's not the answer. But I'm afraid that's what we're seeing an awful lot of.
Unfortunately, we are, and that's why we need your work so much. And Warren, I'm so excited, glad to talk with you again, but good to turn on the recording here so that others could listen in. I hope people will check out Getting Jefferson Right, your podcast, Telling Jefferson Lies, and your forthcoming book, The Christian Past That Wasn't, Debunking the Christian Nationalist Myths That Hijack History. Thanks, Warren, again for joining us, but even more so for all of the important work that you're doing.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much.